So today we are going to talk about critical literacy and how to use critical literacy to encourage reflective democracy. And kind of to activate some prior knowledge, think about, let's say you received an invitation to co-write an article. And the article is on how educators can facilitate hard conversations and discuss current events in the current socio-political climate. And by that, we mean highly polarized. What tips or suggestions would you provide? So take about 60 seconds, maybe 90, and just brainstorm some ideas. And then if you would like to share them in the chat, you could do that, or we can also discuss them in large group when we get back in.
Amy, while they're working on that, I'm actually going to put the field book title in the chat room, in the chat box, so you all can have access to it.
And for those of you who are just joining us, we're doing a little activating prior knowledge. And so if you could imagine you were asked to co-write an article for a journal, and your topic is how educators can facilitate hard conversations and discuss current events in the current socio-political climate. And by that, we mean our current polarized climate. So as an educator, what tips or suggestions would you provide to teacher educators or pre-service teachers?
It's a good idea, Catherine.
Thank you. I'm here, but Shem is also here, so that's why I'm muted and video is off. But I'm here.
I definitely noted along the foster relationships in the classroom, kind of norms for discussion and establishing those kind of protocols first.
And Catherine, we actually have a media bias chart that we'll be able to show you later on. Absolutely. That's a great resource.
So far we have that idea of fostering relationships, establishing norms, utilizing the media bias chart. Any other ideas that you would include in your article about how to facilitate these difficult conversations?
I think having multiple opportunities for reflection and in different ways. So having, independent reflection time, small group time to discuss and process, and then having that kind of reflection time in various channels, whether it's like journaling or talking out loud, like just having, discussion, but having multiple avenues for kind of processing the ideas and information.
So
Good point.
and I think not just leading conversations about current events off the top of the head that just occur spontaneously, but to use some of the advice like from Diana Hess in preparing for discussion and teaching how to discuss, so that planning particular topics or some particular conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And there are really great organizations out there too that help prepare these things. So for example, on January 6th, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation, Facing History and Ourselves came out with a great lesson for teachers and posted it, that day, and resources teachers could use the next day. So Carol, that's a really great idea, not just going off the cuff, but being very strategic, being prepared, because that makes us a bit more comfortable, and then having those stems prepared and those questions prepared.
I've always thought that modeling is really important. So I think a lot of people are reluctant to engage in difficult conversations because they've never seen one done well.
And Charlie, you make a really interesting point, adding to that in the chat when you say someone who takes a contrary position. And that's definitely very important because a lot of adults don't even know what that should look like or sound like. So modeling that for our students. So thinking about doing a little role play with a student and saying, okay, so Charlie, I hear what you're saying and I appreciate that fact. One thing I might add to that is I have a concern about, and giving that idea language stems, modeling for students what a conversation could look and sound like when we don't agree with someone.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of connects to it. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that it doesn't have to be an either or, but the way that you gave that example, Amy, was a both and, you know, like I acknowledge what you're saying and I'm going to add to it because there's a concern. So it's not polarizing, but it's still honoring the different perspectives and considerations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and students pay attention to those things. They hear what we say and they also hear what we don't say. They pay attention to silence. And so just like Charlie was saying, modeling, they'll pay attention to that and hearing that extra perspective. Anyone else? Okay. So today we're going to discuss the critical literacy framework, and we have a relatively informative slide. I think you'll be able to categorize what the critical literacy, and we're also going to assess your understanding of that framework. Similar to the last session, we were, did I freeze up?
Just a little bit.
For a second.
Okay. Similar to the last conversation that we were having, literacy, critical literacy, media literacy is especially important now because there's so much, we're inundated with social media, news stories. Sometimes students don't really know what to believe and what's real and what's fake news. So critical literacy is going to be very, very important in today's presentation or discussion. We're also going to examine how critical literacy can be applied in our field as it relates to promoting reflective democracy. And we have a couple examples of some things that we're going to talk about, Dr. Seuss, critical race theory, that should spark that conversation and allow us to apply some of these strategies to what we're doing in the classrooms and with our teacher educators. I'll give you all a moment to read that. Paulo Freire. I think a lot of people would like for things to be neutral. It sort of puts us in a comfortable spot, a comfortable position. Maybe except as social scientists, we're always out for this isn't neutral and why not. But I think we all know things are not neutral in these conversations sometimes. So we just thought that was a very powerful quote and something to build upon our discussion today.
And oftentimes teachers are tasked with being neutral. It was interesting. I was, I'm teaching 2 courses this term and we were having an online discussion, and one of the students in his discussion comment, he wrote that every time we make a decision to teach something or give a voice to one thing, we are not giving a voice to another thing. And I thought, that was a really interesting way to phrase that. And someone just talked about that idea of multiple perspectives and incorporating multiple voices. In what ways do we choose to voice things or silence other things? And what are we choosing to voice and silence? And how can we give more voice and less silence to certain areas? Because the idea of being neutral, I would challenge that notion, because I don't really think that is, although we may not try to say that I'm voting for this person in an election, teaching in itself is a political act, and thinking about how are we bringing that to the classroom? How are we giving voice to this?
I think social media, different news stories exploded because this isn't news that you can take on as neutral. People even use 2 different terms, which shook up the term neutral. They called it an insurrection or riot, and people are still kind of wrestling with that term. And I think that kind of connects to where they're coming from. So no neutrality, which is also why I think critical race theory is such a big deal now, because when it comes to telling history, if you bring up critical race theory, it's not allowing you to exist in a neutral space. When you talk about the history of slavery, it's not allowing you to exist in a neutral space. So
So thinking about January 6th, 2021, just think where you were. I'm pretty sure that all of us will remember for the rest of our lives where we were when we figured out what happened, when we were learning more information, but just kind of give yourselves 30 seconds of complete quiet time to reflect on your feelings and emotions of that particular day. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Greg is going to share his, because we're going to give you an opportunity to engage in some silent dialogue based on those reflections you just had.
All right. My bar is hidden. One second.
Your screen is kind of blurry for me.
Okay, let me try to refresh it. Are you all able to see the screen now? It should say what emotions.
Better.
It's better. It's still blurry though.
Okay, so let's see if this is able to pop up on your phone. We're going to do a short assessment. It's called Mentimeter. So let me see. I might be able to put it in the chat box. If you go to your phone or your personal learning device, go to menti.com, menti.com. I'll see if I can put it in the chat box.
I am right now.
I need you to spell it again.
menti.com, menti.com. And thanks for putting it in chat box, Aim. If you go to menti.com, you should see a page that prompts you with questions or to enter a code. I'm gonna read the code out loud, and I'll also put it in the chat box.
Wait a minute, something's wrong. Wait a minute.
menti.com, menti.
M-E-N.
T-I, yeah.
I,
Yes.
not like a mentee. Okay.
menti.com, and it should prompt you to put in a code. And I'll embed the code in the chat box as well.
I'm doing it right now.
Okay.
And if you can see Greg's screen right now, at the top of it, it says go to www.menti.com and use the code 96169282.
Could you read it again, because I can't see it very well?
Yes, the number?
Yes.
Yes, 96169282.
That's not what I see.
Sorry.
I see 96199282.
I think I might have typed it wrong. My apologies.
Okay.
I should have cut and pasted.
That's okay. Let me start all over. Are you ready?
Yeah.
9616.
Yep.
Well, she said 16. You said 16. Charlie said.
Sorry.
Is
All
it
right, are you ready?
1619? Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
96169282.
Oh, we got what emotions did the insurrection at the Capitol bring for you? Cute.
There you go.
And then
It's
your answers
magic. It's
pop
not
up.
technology, it's magic.
So what emotions did news of the insurrection at the Capitol raise for you? Someone said anger, embarrassment, disappointment, insecurity, uncertainty, fear, shock. Disbelief, horrified. Are you all able to see these?
Oh, we're supposed to pick the ones that you're saying?
Oh, no. Your responses come up anonymously, and this is an activity that you can do with your class so that they can be anonymous in how they respond to a question, especially a controversial question.
So if you can see Greg's screen right now, you'll see that the topics, the feelings you all have typed in on your phones are now appearing on the screen. So the most recent one I see is sadness. So this is a tool that you can use for free, menti.com. You can get a subscription where it allows you to do more complex things, but the free version allows you to do things such as this. So you can ask questions, you can have students enter their responses anonymously.
And another response was disbelief, horrified, jaw-dropping, stunned, fear for the safety of representatives, specific fear for Ocasio-Cortez and the other women of color. It was very sad. Second day of infamy. Kind of reminded me of 9/11. You almost look and you're like, is this real? Okay. All right, I'm going to exit. Okay. I love sharing resources. I love obtaining resources too. So it's called Mentimeter, and these are sort of the directions. I put down a background for us to kind of think about, but it's very easy to get into. It's almost like Kahoot or quizzes or Nearpod or Peer Deck, if you all have heard of that. And I'll put those in the chat box as well.
This was kind of an activity called silent dialogue. An old school way to do it pre-technology is just to get big sheets of chart paper and have students sit at a table and use markers and write their feelings and not necessarily discuss them, or you could display them and discuss them. But this allows us an opportunity to bring in technology, allow students to share their thoughts anonymously, and then we can have conversations about them. But thinking about January 6th, and then thinking about students coming to school the next day, really made Greg and I, when we were reflecting on this presentation, think about an article that was published in Teaching Tolerance, Now Learning for Justice, in 2016, and it was called Don't Say Nothing. And I remember specifically, we were there for NCSS.
We were in DC.
The Jefferson Monument, and this article showed up, and we stopped on the steps of the Jefferson Monument and sat down and we read it together. And it's this idea of don't say nothing. And students pay attention to everything we say and do. They particularly pay attention to our silence. And when you don't have the words and can't plan the lessons, don't just say nothing. Say exactly what you're feeling. That will mean more to your students than you may ever know. And maybe you don't say anything, you let them say the words through silent dialogue or through something. But when things happen, when, for example, when George Floyd is killed and students come to school the next day or probably that Tuesday, if you say nothing, you're sending a message. And even if you don't know what to say, thinking about how do we allow our students to serve as the experts and bring in their voices and allow their experiences to structure the conversation and format the conversation. So today we're talking about this idea of critical literacy pedagogy. And I am highly concerned by recent legislation about the attack on critical race theory and the attacks on having certain conversations in the classroom. And I was working with a school district in Indiana, and they were talking about, well, critical race theory is such a big part of what we do. Now, in my mind, you don't have many K-12 teachers saying, I use critical race theory in the classroom. You might use it to inform your practice, but parents for the most part, they like the idea of critical thinking. So if we can frame things around critical literacy, we are teaching our students to think critically. We are teaching our students to utilize critical literacy to have informed perspectives. So not that we are, quote unquote, indoctrinating, which is a big phrase that's being thrown around lately, indoctrinating students, but we are giving them multiple perspectives to form opinions. Because the reality is, previously, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in some cases now, the perspectives that they're being given are quite limited. So how do we ensure that we are giving them multiple voices and multiple perspectives? So when we think about critical literacy, it's been around for quite some time, and they're really thinking about it as a pedagogical practice that promotes principles of democracy, equity, and social justice. So it's not a strategy, but it's an approach to teaching. And it uses a critical lens to engage with text. Now, originally back in the late 80s, when this term really started to be utilized, it talked about text, but now we have electronic text. We have blogs, we have websites, we have podcasts, we have all kinds of things that might also be interpreted as text. But then we consider how they are presented and positioned historically, culturally, and politically. So allowing our students to think about how the power structure influences what is being said and the potential increased justice for those who have been placed on the margins. So let's say, for example, we are teaching about earlier the idea of happy slaves came up. So this idea of, if you have a textbook that presents slaves in such a way that they are portrayed as being pleased or happy, perhaps we're bringing in other narratives from, for example, the Library of Congress, slave narratives, where slaves, people who are enslaved rather, are giving their narrative about their experience and their situation. And then allowing students to think about, this is how the textbook portrays people, this is how this certain person portrayed their life, and then thinking about the power structure of how the story is portrayed in the text as into how it is portrayed by a particular person. Because we know we tend to give more credibility to a textbook because it seems so official. It's in an expensive hardcover and it's by this prestigious company. Whereas if you're looking at just a journal article or looking at just a diary entry, that may not be given as much prestige. But then thinking about who had the power to make those decisions and articulate certain stories. But then also critical literacy, thinking really just about increasing critical consciousness. And that really just means our critical awareness of the world, what is going on around us. And one of the phrases I always use with my students is, we all have glasses that we use to see the world, and our world is shaded by the glasses that we wear. And those glasses are framed by where we were born, who raised us, the geographic area where we were raised, the people that we're around, the job that we have, all of these things. But we need to be sensitive to the fact that our world is shaded based on our experiences, and allowing students to understand that. It also brings in the teacher-student partnership. So the teacher isn't the sage on the stage, but that idea of continual dialogue, going back to the Pitts article from earlier, thinking about allowing our students to be experts. There may be some things that we teach about and talk about that our students experience and understand better than I might as a teacher or a professor. So allowing myself to learn from my students and have that reciprocal exchange. Also building on the world around them, including language, respecting people's language and experiences and utilizing them as assets. And the one thing about critical literacy, it goes back to that idea, it critiques the concept of a universal truth, and it challenges that notion of neutrality. And this one becomes difficult because we do present certain things in a social studies classroom as facts and as a universal truth, but then also thinking about how are those truths positioned based on people's experiences, and how do we differentiate between what is perceived as subjective and what is perceived as objective. So really thinking about critical literacy in general focuses on power dynamics, inequalities, and injustices. Questions how power relates to privilege and oppression, and encourages interrogation of related issues. So, for example, right now when we have people who are protesting critical race theory. How does this relate to privilege and oppression? And what are the related issues? For example, people who are resisting, are they privileged in a certain way? And is there a related issue that they don't want to come into the conversation or be on the stage? It considers multiple perspectives when we go to critical race theory, really thinking about that language of counter stories, but giving voice to multiple perspectives, multiple stories, particularly stories of people who have historically and currently been placed on the margins. And it also examines and asks our students to examine how they see and interact with the world. So I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. My experience of growing up and interacting with the world would be very different than someone who grew up in Birmingham in the city and lived in a high rise with lots of neighbors and lots of people around them. So me growing up in rural Pennsylvania would also be a different social political context than Birmingham, Alabama. So asking our students to recognize that idea of place and how that influences people's interpretations and experiences. It provides students appropriate space and resources to make better sense of the world around them. So it's not just driving one message and this is the truth and this is the reality, but allowing them to have exposure to multiple resources and multiple stories and determine. So one of the ways that I've seen this done, teachers will make manila envelopes, and this is before COVID when we could share things, and have multiple resources in that particular folder about a particular historical event. Photographs, blogs, journals, news articles, and then get them to answer questions about that. But then also having multiple perspectives in relation to that event so they could come up with a determination based on what they thought happened. But it ultimately empowers students to inquire about decisions. So why did certain things happen? So for example, if we're thinking about the Capitol and it is being, the language we're using is an insurrection, but it's not necessarily a protest or a riot, what is the difference in the language there? And getting them to inquire about that decision of language to call it an insurrection. And getting them to think about, how do we make the world a better, more just place? So how do we do this? What can activities look like? Reading supplementary text, which we've talked about. So not just basing everything on the textbooks. A lot of teachers, a lot of districts aren't even using textbooks anymore. So this is becoming much more common of utilizing supplementary text, supplementary resources to reinforce and inform ideas. Reading multiple texts, so not just looking at one particular event and interpretation and taking that as quote unquote truth, but looking at multiple perspectives and determining how different people feel about the same situation. Reading from a resistant perspective. This is definitely becoming much more common as well, but specifically looking at people who might resist the dominant narrative or the way that a situation is being portrayed. We can also get students to produce counter text. So if they don't exist, asking them to write a journal entry or a diary entry that could counter the story that they have been presented with. Student choice research projects and taking social action. There's a lot of really interesting stuff now about using social media. For example, Twitter. There's a lot of research when teachers are teaching about a particular topic in class and then they assign students to make posts on Twitter in relation to a particular event. And then it's not just impacting the conversation in your classroom, but it's impacting the conversations with students who those particular students are connected to and the conversation in their larger context with their families. So when we look at critical literacy and the application of it, Berman in 2006, and this research really has not been contested, looked to see these are the most common activities that we see teachers utilize to facilitate this particular approach in the classroom.
I'll actually put it in the chat box if people want to access it.
So again, really just critically examining the text, not just believing it because it says it in the print in front of us, but What does it mean? Why do we think the authors portrayed it this way? Why is it presented this way? How might it be portrayed differently if it was written by a different person who had a different experience? Using text to examine social issues and using students' lives and experience as text. And this is one thing which I think is really interesting. I was talking to someone in higher ed, and she's worked at an institution for a very, very long time, and she's an associate professor. So I said to her, if you don't mind me asking, why are you still an associate professor? And she said, well, to be honest with you, my first language is Spanish, and I prefer to publish in Spanish-speaking Spanish journals. And the university doesn't perceive that to be as rigorous as it needs to be. So I've just decided that I'm not going to bother, and I'm going to do my work in the language that I want to. And it's really interesting to me because this institution, which I won't say the name, is a huge advocate for social justice. But when I think about the idea of, lives and experiences and what's valued and what isn't, that idea of who gets published, what languages does it need to be in, who is perceived as being more credible to be published. And even in our world in academia, that definitely influences our world, because if she doesn't have the, if her words aren't in Spanish, are not going to be perceived as valued as her words in English, thinking about the message that sends. So allowing us to use our own experiences and our students' experiences, because the reality is some of us have not had the avenues to get our stories included. Obviously, literature is becoming much more inclusive. Textbooks are doing a better job, but it hasn't always been that way. So thinking about, there are experiences that are out there and that are credible and are valuable to people's interpretation of the world, but they don't necessarily make it to print in a way that informs our students in an academic type of way. So allowing our students to reflect on their lives and their experiences and use that as material as well. And Baldwin, Greg and I rarely do a presentation without quoting Baldwin, but he says, "I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And this makes me think a lot about conversations I've had with people recently who say, well, you should love America, you should love the country. I think it can be both and. You can love the country and you can think this is a wonderful place and I really appreciate living here and the opportunities that I have. But I also recognize that there are things that I would want to be different and would want to be better. So as a citizen, I have that right to criticize her perpetually because this is a place in which I'm proud of, but there are also things that happen here of which I am not proud. Mm-hmm. And this goes to a report that came out this spring. It's called Educating for American Democracy. And our SSEC fellow members, the Bursons, were part of the team when Greg and I were going through and reading all of this. We were like, oh, Michael and Eileen are in here as well as being partners for this. But it's this idea of how do we educate for American democracy? And there are strategies that they utilize. It's a really fantastic user-friendly report that we can utilize with pre-service teachers or in-service teachers. But there's a quote in it. It says, "We are responsible for cultivating in ourselves and the young the reflective patriotism needed to navigate the dangerous shoals we now face as we chart a course between cynicism and nostalgia. To those who believe in Americans' principles and promise, what we have inherited is painfully imperfect. It is our task not to abandon, but to improve it." So that idea, when we talk to our students, thinking about this is a wonderful place and we teach about democracy and we teach about citizenship, but we don't want to just go in blindly and say everything is great and everything is perfect and red, white, and blue is fabulous. But how can you be fabulous and flawed at the same time? And that idea, I think it brings up this idea of encouraging reflective patriotism. So how, as citizens, can we use our power of reflection to increase our own critical consciousness, to make our world and not just our world here, but our global world and our global context, since we are so interconnected, a better, more just, and more equitable space. So this report is a really great resource to utilize for this concept of increasing critical literacy directly connected to social studies. So I feel like I've been talking a lot. I didn't realize how much talking this was as we were designing this, but yeah, critical race theory. I'm pretty sure we all know what it is. I'm pretty sure that board meeting Charlie was talking about earlier was a result of all of this. We've seen it all across the country. And Greg and I designed this last week, but we have since, this material has since been updated. But currently we have more than 20 states that have introduced legislation restricting lessons on the role of racism in the history of the United States and quote unquote divisive concepts. And it's interesting because the IAP book that our page proofs just came back yesterday for the book that's coming up, and we were reading it last night. And it's interesting because we talked about critical race theory in the book, and it had attention, but not the same amount of attention as it does now, but it's still incredibly appropriate. So in September 2020, President Trump issued the order banning federal contractors from conducting quote unquote diversity training that drew on critical race theory. But I think it was pretty much any diversity training that talked about race-based ideologies and promoted the idea that the United States is an inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. So in my mind, just reading this sentence is such a contradiction, because there are lots of things that were racist that were laws, and lots of things that were racist that were unethical. So, you know, how do we differentiate between racist and evil? And the language itself is very interesting to me. But Governor of Florida, who makes the news a lot, he says the woke class wants to teach kids to hate each other rather than teaching them how to read. And earlier in our session, we talked about this idea that there's this complete misinterpretation of critical race theory. And there is never, in anything that I've read on critical race theory, where you are supposed to teach students to hate each other. And you are not supposed to teach white people to hate themselves. We are increasing racial literacy and thinking about how the implications of race in America have influenced where we are, which also includes a legacy of white supremacy. And then teachers, of course, have expressed how this will impact their practice. So this map, which we got on June 17th, which is now outdated because we have had some changes since then, where we have bills introduced in the legislature and bills passed and signed into law. And then we have other states where no bill has been introduced. So for example, Alabama has changed. We should now be yellow because we had a bill introduced in the legislature in the past week. So, but just thinking about this, a lot of times when people think about racism in America, they automatically think about the South. Well, when we look at this map, we can see that it's pretty much spread across the country. The West Coast, obviously, maybe the place I want to consider moving. But other than that, we have a pretty even distribution of places where bills have been proposed and bills have been passed. And these connect to, for example, Tennessee bill states that schools cannot promote instruction that the US is fundamentally racist or that a person's sex or race is inherently privileged. So it's interesting to me because the only people who could vote in this country at the beginning were white men who owned land. So when we think about the idea of inherently privileged, would teaching about white men owning land, would that be a violation of the law? So there are words in the legislation that make it very subjective. Texas bill restricts how teachers can teach about current events and teach about historical treatment of people of color. Arizona is really interesting. It bans discussions that make anyone feel guilt, anguish, or any psychological distress on the basis of their race, sex, or ethnicity. So Carol made a really interesting comment earlier in our session, basically saying people's reaction to this allows us to see exactly what it is and why it is needed. So that idea of feeling guilty. But I also think about the idea of a teacher. when we teach, we're not asking students to feel guilty. We're asking students to develop a correct understanding of what has happened. And out of that, there might be some things, man, I'm not really proud that the United States did that. Thinking about how do we make it a more just and equitable society now? So also prohibiting lessons that would make students feel responsible for actions committed by other members of the same race, ethnic group, or sex. It's like the people who wrote this felt very personal things. And then also we have impose a fine of up to $5,000 for discussing controversial issues. But then it says discussion of accurate portrayals of historical events are not considered controversial, which now brings us to the concept of the 1619 Project. So if we go back, you can't discuss a controversial issue, but you can discuss accurate portrayals of historical events. So if we look at the 1619 Project, do we deem that as a controversial issue, or do we deem that as an accurate portrayal of a historical event? So thinking about this, and I'm not going to read all of the bullet points here, but really just thinking about, there has been massive resistance. 1619 Project, which was spearheaded by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who works for the New York Times, and lots of people joined the essay, but really just talking about 400 years ago, so it was published in 1619, the arrival of people in the United States, and particularly the implications for enslaved people. And we have seen lots of legislation that bans teaching of this act, suggests that schools and universities should not receive money if this resource is utilized. And as we know, many of us know, President Trump actually appointed the 1776 Commission to write a report on the patriotic history to directly counter the 1619 Project, which then was published, I believe, on Martin Luther King Day. It was released, ironically, and then when 2 days before he left office. And then, of course, one of Biden's first orders was to take it down. So we have this idea of the resistance, but then the reality is it accurate history, or is it history that makes people feel uncomfortable? Is it controversial?
And as an aside, I remember someone said, actually I saw it on TV, I don't remember who said it, but someone said, white folk always want to remember the Alamo. White folk always want to remember the American Revolution, you know, remember how this country was founded. But when it gets to slavery, we just kind of want to skip over that. So I thought it was kind of funny. Obviously, I can't replicate the joke, but it is interesting how we have selective memory, or we delve into some topics that are okay, but once we want to lift up the rug and there's dirt underneath, we want to put the rug down and not talk about it. So I think that's very interesting. And speaking of controversy, along with the 1619 Project, of course, you all remember recently, the Dr. Seuss controversy came up. Is it cancel culture, or is it increased accountability? And there's this researcher, author, library specialist. Her name is Pat Scales. And I don't know if you all have ever heard of Pat Scales, but she was at our university as an alumni, but she moved to Michigan and she's been called on many committees, but she specializes in the banning of literature. So she came to our university and she gave a big spiel on Dr. Seuss. She's sort of a Dr. Seuss expert, and she provided us with these 6 books that were banned. And so I thought that could connect to the idea of cancel culture or increased accountability. Very, very controversial, as some of you all may know. And some of these people who speak against banning or for banning don't even know all the books that actually were banned. And I didn't either until I heard her presentation. So there's a lot of misinformation, misconception out there, very similar to 1619 Project and critical race theory. So I just want to lay all these out so we can check them out. And I'm actually going to delve into If I Ran the Zoo. And as you all remember, there are a lot of racist images throughout these books, racist language. Some of it is connected to actual culture, what some people wear in different parts of the world, but some of it is exaggerated or inappropriate terms used. So let's delve into If I Ran the Zoo. And as we look at some of these images, kind of try to connect that to some of the strategies that we learned and discussed earlier related to critical literacy, and think about how your students can unpack some of these stereotypes, generalizations, and racist imagery. in order to understand the book, why they were banned, and how can they apply that to other work that we use in our classrooms.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So when you look at If I Ran the Zoo by Dr. Seuss, you can see that these are the images which are depicting inappropriately pygmies in Africa. On the left, I think that's depicting Cossacks in Eastern Europe. And on the right, which I want to focus on and provide a description for, is how this young Chinese man is eating with chopsticks, and the chopsticks are exaggerated and very large. And you can see on his head, he's wearing a doily, Gita on his feet, and a kesaya. And can anyone correct me on that? And so these are images that were used throughout the book. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's the language that was used at the time, or Dr. Seuss was trying to make a point. So we can have these conversations, but it's important that our students know how to look at this in a critical way and apply some of these strategies versus, oh, this is the way people are in China, because that's not what we want them to walk away with. And I think there are about 4 or 5 other racist images. And I don't know all of the techniques, but I think there are about 4 or 5 techniques that authors use to correct some of this racist imagery or some of the language. So that's why sometimes you'll see a Dr. Seuss book from its initial year, maybe 1950 or 1955, and then there'll almost be a remake. So there might be one made again like in 1965 or 1970. And one of the techniques is to actually make the skin white or unslant the eyes, because there was some language used like their eyes all aslant or their skin color would be yellow, very similar to the images on the left. And so students are to assume that they're Asian or Chinese or Japanese. And so the artist will make the skin white to sort of neutralize that or not make it seem so exaggerated. There's another book, I can't remember the name, you all might know the name, but there are 2 slaves hiding in a cupboard eating food. And the artist actually corrected and addressed that correction in the book, because slaves wouldn't be eating food in a cupboard in the kitchen. But these images were made, and unless you have or use a strategy like critical literacy or media literacy, students will walk away thinking slaves are able to hide in cupboards and eat food away from the master. So some of these things are incorrect, and some of these things just need conversation so that students don't walk away with these as truths. And this is a media chart, the media bias chart that we talked about earlier. We even talked about in other session with Carol. If you look on the left, those are of course left-leaning. On the right, more conservative. And this is something that could serve as a useful tool to your students. You could also make it interactive. Let's try another activity. Let's see if this will work. So we're going to try an activity using Nearpod. So on your personal learning device or your cell phone, go to join.nearpod.com or just type in join Nearpod, and a prompt should come up immediately for you to enter a code. And I'll tell you the code in just a minute. So you can type in join Nearpod or join.nearpod.com, but as soon as you put in Nearpod, it should pop up. Thanks.
Now, if you've never done this, I'm going to let you know the music freaks me out a little bit. It makes me nervous, but we've tried it several times, and you should have more than enough time to answer each of the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, Greg, you have the, oh, okay. You're kind of blurry when you share though.
I don't know why it does that. If anyone has any ideas, you can put them in the chat box or contact me later, but I got to do some research as soon as I get off, because that's kind of annoying. Okay, so if you're at the page that prompts you for the code, you'll type in 9ABX7, and I'll actually put that in the chat box. Let me see. 9A. So the code is 9ABX7. And let's get back in there. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
All right. And if you're not able to see the screen, you can also see it on your phone.
All right. And then once you are in, you'll enter your name. You can be something fake if you would like. And then you'll click join lesson. And then it will kind of go, it'll pace with you. So you can go through, you'll choose your character. And then you'll push start.
I saw the penguin pop up. Amy is in. Catherine is in. They're all penguins. Everyone's choosing penguins under the water.
All the cool kids like penguins.
I lost the code. Can you give it to me again?
Yes. Are you ready?
Yes.
9, A as in aardvark, B as in boy, X as in xylophone, 7. 9, A, B, X, 7. Laura, you're in there. Dean is in there. Catherine and Amy. And Carol, let me know if you need the code again.
Am I in?
Not yet.
Did you pick a character?
I have to choose a character, right?
Yes.
Well, I'm pushing it. Nothing's happening.
Is there a start button at the bottom after you select?
Oh, yes. Okay.
There you go.
You're in now.
All right. I think we can get to 1 or 2 questions.
Are we still going?
Yeah, I exited for the sake of time. I don't know if you all are able to still see it on your phones.
Because I couldn't read the writing, so that's why mine was 0 points.
Should I make it larger next time?
No, well,
I didn't know what it looked like from your end.
yeah, but that's okay.
Well, I at least wanted you all to try it. I just thought it was something cool that
Yeah.
Amy found after a while, and we've used before. It's called Nearpod.
I don't know if there's a way to change the music because the music pretty much drives me crazy and it causes me anxiety. So I don't know if there's a different way to, and now I can hear it all over the house because it's still on Greg's computer. It's on my phone, it's everywhere. But okay, so we are almost out of time. Actually, we are out of time. So we are really grateful that you have joined us. If there's our resources are here, just so you see them, that we are not plagiarizing or taking people's work without credit. So the resources are on the last page. If there are questions, concerns, comments, we will hang in here until there's nobody left. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Yeah, great resources. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, I was taking notes for my fall class kind of as we were going along on my Post-it. So thank you so much.
If there's anything we can send you, just let us know.
Okay. Awesome.